what really has given me hope, and this is where the optimism is that, I have also spent the past 25 years studying social movements, studying activism, studying civic engagement, and studying protest, with much of it around climate. But, I also study activism and movements. Like my last book was called American Resistance, which was the coalition working to push back against the Trump regime. And in all of those cases, I find it amazingly heartening. And I find that that's where our power lies, in the people, in the way we work together. And I have full confidence that people will work together to push back.
Hello and welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director. Today we're continuing our environmental series, Living on Borrowed Time, which is examining the pending climate apocalypse that we find ourselves hurtling towards faster than many imagined. That's, of course, if you discount the fossil fuel industry, who actually knew the environmental impact from the start. And if you don't believe me, watch our previous episode of Cambridge Forum. This documents how big oil covered up the facts 65 years ago. So today we find ourselves in a world which is becoming harder and harder to navigate. This week saw the publication of a scientific report from the University of Western Australia, which recorded temperatures in ocean sponges at 1.7 degrees Celsius. Well past 1.5. These scientists anticipate the sponge temperatures will reach 2 degrees Celsius by the end of 2020s. A new scientific report from Utrecht University this week forecasts the collapse of the Atlantic Ocean's circulation system of currents that regulates global climate. And of course, we all know that COP28's failure was the sinking of humanity's shared lifeboat, I quote from The Guardian, and that there are only, quote, few hours left to act. That was pretty stark. So links to all those articles are in the chat if you want to read the articles. Well, since there's no way to sugarcoat the situation we find ourselves in, today's program is actually going to look at what options we've got left to us. We've got 4 guests. They're all involved in the climate movement, but in different ways. We're going to start with Professor Dana Fisher, whose new book entitled Saving Ourselves: From Climate Shocks to Climate Action, which comes out today, provides a stirring call to action. Then we're going to talk to polar explorer and activist Dr. Susana Hancock, who literally goes to the ends of the earth to save the planet. And then finally, we have 2 older activists, one on each coast, Pennie Opal plant in California, Kathleen Sullivan in Maine. And they reflect a new demographic, the women who make up 61% of climate activists today. So welcome to all 4 of you. Okay, I'm going to start with you, Dana. You're a professor at American University, director of the Center for Environment, Community and Equity. This book is a real wake-up call. Was it born of desperation? Is that what made you write it?
Well, I wouldn't use the word desperation, but it was born of frustration and anxiety, I guess. I mean, it's interesting because I do a lot of research studying activists, and there's been this question about whether anxiety and depression will demobilize people and make them feel like they won't do anything. And I've actually in my research found that it is one of the most common emotions that people feel who are out marching in the streets is sadness and despair. So I guess maybe I was motivated in a similar way. I mean, it's not despair exactly, instead it's just so much frustration with all of the work that I've been doing for the past 25 years. I mean, I started studying the climate policy making process when I was in graduate school. That was in the 1990s. My first book, which is over here over my shoulder, was around the Kyoto Protocol, which is like ancient history now, where we all thought if we just work together, we can save the world, and went to all these big meetings and we all felt like it was going to matter, and there was real transparency and civil society groups were engaged, and and then I contributed to the IPCC and I felt like now the science is going to set us free. And, none of that has really mattered in the grand scheme of things. Sure, the projections are not as dire as they had been in the worst case models, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And it became clear to me that I had to stop focusing on writing papers for peer-reviewed journals and try to take what I found and bring it together to talk to the public so people could understand where we are and where we need to be and the role that we all need to play in saving ourselves. And thus the book was born.
Well, you wrote it very quickly because it really springs sort of in the last couple of years. So it's very timely. And in the book, you show how both the private and the public sectors have proved to be pretty totally actually ineffective in dealing with the scale of the crisis. And then that's been bolstered by the fossil fuel industry, which somehow has never been reined in or even penalized by governments or the UN. And so they've actually failed to protect us. So yet you're an apocalyptic optimist, you say.
Well, I mean, what I would say about that is I document the ways that these privileged interests, which, we were required to call them vested interests in the IPCC, it's basically fossil fuel interests, right? They have had privileged access to power and resources, right? They have subsidies that help them extract fossil fuels from public lands. They have the ear of decision makers because they fund many of their campaigns and we haven't taken money out of politics. And so then the decision makers are extremely well documented as voting in support of their interests, right? So the states are captured and some business interests want to move forward with a just transition. And then the other business interests want to drag their feet because they want to continue making money. So anybody who thinks that, the state or the market, as we like to talk about it in the social sciences, is going to get us there without there being a real push from civil society is misunderstanding these processes at work. However, I mean, I guess, and so that's the apocalyptic part, right? Things are getting bad. They're going to get worse. We're going to hear from Susana about some of that, I think, in a little bit. But what really has given me hope, and this is where the optimism is that, I have also spent the past 25 years studying social movements, studying activism, studying civic engagement, and studying protest, with much of it around climate. But, I also study activism and movements. Like my last book was called American Resistance, which was the coalition working to push back against the Trump regime. And in all of those cases, I find it amazingly heartening. And I find that that's where our power lies, in the people, in the way we work together. And I have full confidence that people will work together to push back. The question is how bad it's going to get before that happens, and will it be too late for frontline communities, for some communities of color, for coastal areas? And the unfortunate reality is that it may very well be for some areas. I mean, we already see what's going on in Tuvalu and a number of other small island states. So I am optimistic, but I am also realistic in the fact that not everybody's going to be okay. And what we really need to do is work together to try to help as many as possible.
So you refer to this thing in the book called an anthro shift, which you say is required. And this is a massive shock that's severe and durable enough to affect real change. You also say we have a rapidly closing window, that we will have to endure, quote, a disaster or many. And finally, that mass mobilization is absolutely essential. So that's a lot to cover, I know, in one sentence. But perhaps you could talk to this trigger, this anthro shift. How do you think that might come about?
So an anthro shift is actually, it is the reorientation of all the social actors that work together. So right now, all of us in the United States are living under a state where, business interests and political interests are pretty well aligned, right? They work very closely together. The state is somewhat permeable and open to civil society, but anybody who's tried to, ask the administration to declare a climate emergency or to stop expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure knows they're not that open to civil society interests. And anthro shift is when these actors shift in the ways that they interact with one another. And the motivation for that is experience of risk. And it can be a perception of risk, like we had during the beginning of the COVID pandemic when everybody was worried they would get sick and die. Or it can be experience of real risk, as people do after natural disasters, which are also climate exacerbated, right? Extreme weather events, we have wildfire, we have drought, we have hurricanes. The list goes on and on. We all know what I'm talking about here. And in those cases, this extreme events actually mobilize people to feel personal, tangible risk that is driven by climate change, that motivates them to open up a window of opportunity to push for change, push for policymakers to respond. And what we know from research around social movements is that when social movements push hard enough, and I talk a lot about the experiences of the civil rights movement. I talk about women's suffrage. I talk a little bit about the movement after George Floyd was murdered against systemic racism. Talk about how when people push hard enough and when there's enough of them, the state responds because it has to maintain its legitimacy, or else it will lose power. So that's that moment, and that's the moment that I'm hopeful we will get to.
So I don't doubt that that's possible. I just, I wonder every single time I think, oh, this is it. This is it. This is the pivot point. It passes along and, okay, so half of New Jersey goes into the ocean or whatever, those towns where they've got people rebuild. The same has happened, not to the same degree, but the climate fires we had on the West in California, some rebuilding's gone on there. So I wonder, it always seems to be somebody else's problem. Now, I agree, it's not something we can fix individually. I get that. It has to be a massive action against the fossil fuel industry that's really going to make the difference. We can't do it alone. However, I do think those things are incremental. So I think we'll get to that in a minute, because both of these activists have been willing to sacrifice big deals because they feel it's right. So I think we'll get to that in a moment. So I'm just going to pop over now and talk to Dr. Susana Hancock. She's a scientific explorer who spends about half her life on the polar ice caps. In fact, she just came back this weekend. When you're not on the ice, Susana, you're working with global leaders, heads of state, decision makers to help them understand the implications of the climate risk globally. So let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing, because you told me that some Arctic changes are occurring 7 times faster than elsewhere, and maybe even faster than that, which is really frightening to me. And you had an expedition recently to try and recreate the North Pole expedition that Shackleton went on. And his expedition failed because his ship got trapped in the ice. Yours failed because there wasn't any ice. So are you scared, first of all, by what you're witnessing up in the polar ice caps?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dana. It's certainly terrifying for me. It's terrifying to be in a place and see changes and to understand what's going on as well. And I think I've been very interested in the psychology of that as well. When I go up with climate scientists, what is actually happening? How are we processing this information? And there's different ways of people disconnecting themselves a little bit or really becoming very emotional. But yes, the area where I've most recently been doing work is warming about 7 times faster than the rest of the world. And a year and a half ago, I got back from an expedition where we sought to retrace an expedition by Swedish explorer Otto Fredrik Nordenskjöld from 1872, 1873. So 150 years later. And what was different, and they took amazing data, amazing climate photographs, journals to prove that they would be the first to the North Pole, which they were there about 37 years prior to anyone that we know in Western communities achieving that. And so they failed, but they failed because there was too much ice. And I had to call for rescue off the sea ice, which we were expecting. So we did have that planned into this. But yeah, it's I'm off to Greenland shortly for an expedition. In Greenland, we now know it's, it used to, like my fact that I could say that Greenland was melting approximately 17 million bottles of wine per second in terms of its ice loss or water loss. And we now know that that's probably an underestimate by about 20%. So, I mean, it's just the degree to which changes are happening is terrifying. And it's, you're in a spot where, I mean, I've been in places where I haven't had time to take a photograph because I'm like, I'm not sure I'm actually going to get through this piece of ice. It's melting so quickly. So
So, despite all that, you also attend a lot of these conferences. You've been to several COP conferences. You've been to the World Economic Forums. You say over time you've become more and more resigned to the lack of real progress at these things. But this hasn't stopped you from sleeping in a tent at Davos and from drawing a line about potential flood levels on the buildings at COP28 in Dubai, which very brave action right there. So before you tell me about Dubai, what do you hope to achieve by doing these little kind of look at this, me in a tent? What does it do to people?
well, there's several things. One, some of that is certainly media stunts a little bit that catch attention, and using that attention to capture interest and to highlight to people. So for example, you go to World Economic Forum, it's really hard to stand out with something. There's a lot of competing events, but you talk to heads of state and you're like, hey, I'm actually sleeping outside and it's 30 below, come check us out. And they're there. We set up an expedition tent that we have just talks in, we have displays. This year did a whole virtual reality of the Arctic change. And we had waiting lists, people who want to come and chat. And I'm doing briefings with executives, with oil companies, talking with them about what their impacts are, what their contributions are, and how that's impacting the entire world. And that is something that for me, it's been really powerful. Last year, I had one where with one of the world's largest plastics polluters, and we finished our briefing and they got right on the phone and said that they need to have an emergency meeting because they have to shut down one of their processing plants that they had just green lighted to open. So it's a way to, I guess, really actually seeing some of those impacts that we can have by being there and by being in those places.
So tell me a bit about Dubai, because you told me that the air quality was so awful there that you actually had to wear a mask and that you had to walk to this one section of the conference where all the top officials were, which had filtered air, just so you could breathe. So how come I never saw any of that reported anywhere?
Yeah, so my hotel was right on the metro line and it overlooked the world's largest gas plant, natural gas plant. They did not turn it off for the conference. There was flaring out my window. Those of us who took the metro to the conference saw the flaring, especially at night. They argued that they didn't do it. And it was, to me, very, very shocking how little attention was given to even trying to greenwash that, which is what I've seen before in many places. But no, I couldn't see the next metro station from my apartment, which was a 3-minute ride away, it's because the air was so hazy and so foggy. I was having headaches all the time at the conference. A handful of people are having nosebleeds. I went with somebody who was having a nosebleed and was getting a little bit concerned about it. And we went to the medical tent and the doctor said that lots of people have been coming in with strange complaints involving things like headaches, sore throats, coughs, nosebleeds, which they're putting down to the air quality. So I did choose to wear a mask. For me, it was a little bit funny because I wasn't masking inside, whereas in the COVID years, I would mask inside and go outside. And here I was masking outside and not inside. But it was pretty shocking the year.
And what did you do with the marking when you went around to the building?
Well, so as you may recall, it hit the news that during the first week, many of the discussions at COP28 at the high level ended up getting into whether climate science actually exists. And we're looking at climate science 101, not actual conversations about the role of fossil fuels or what can we do about this as a global community. And so I joined together with a handful of other climate scientists. We started off as a polar climate group, but we brought together the WWF, we brought together all sorts of different nonprofits who were represented there, and went and got permission from the UN to have a protest, which, just like they were last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, banned officially. So we had to get special permission for that. And the UN was very happy for us to do it because it was actually putting climate science, sort of pushing that a little bit in their agenda. And so we found that the conference bisected the 10-meter sea level rise line. And while 10 meters is a little ways away, big parts of the city are being built in areas that are only having a buffer of built for about 30 centimeters to 50 centimeters of sea level rise. So we're looking at, and we're going to achieve a meter there maybe by 2070. And they're just putting billions and billions into something that's just, not going to see out the decade or two. So I went with one friend and we did photographs with little demonstrations all over the city. And with an organization, built up a campaign over the week, and we had our final 10-meter event where we had nonprofits and scientists, senior scientists, which was really exciting. People who generally don't get out and protest. And we had heads of state, we had the head of COP last year, lots of people who came over and were really invested in it. So.
I hope it wasn't just a photo opportunity for them.
No, we did take some photos, but no, I hope it was
more than that. Yeah.
A little bit more impactful.
All right, you are the youngest person in this cohort of folk here, by far, and you started joining up the climate dots very early. You were questioning as a young skier the environmental impact of the wax on your skis on the environment, which I think is incredibly prescient. So do you think there's enough people of your age that are really willing to take radical action to save the planet?
Well, I would say no, that I think there's can always be more. But what I do really appreciate, and I did get to do a program at COP on this, was that it's become very acceptable for my generation to be scientists, but also be activists. Whereas in older generations, if you were, you would really, in many cases, be putting your career on the line if you took a stand politically or socially. And now we do it. And it's the number of friends of mine, the number of times I have said, when somebody has said, I'm not sure that this is appropriate, it's like, well, this is what I'm going to do. And, go ahead, have the recourse. And we've gotten through it. And so I think there's really been a generational push that we're here first as activists, and we're using our science to back up the activism, and they're working together. And
it's interesting that you raise that, because the climate has changed so much, the media climate, the political climate, that just for doing your job as a climate scientist, you can get into trouble. As Michael Mann proved yesterday, finally got the judgment in after 7 years of court cases.
Yep.
Of just telling the truth. I mean, telling the truth can get you into a lot of trouble, which is a terrible thing in this world, that you're having to defend facts as being they're not an opinion, they're actually a fact. However, that's another whole story. Okay, so last question for you right now. As a science on the actual front line of climate change, do you think it's too late? And do you think people really are willing to make the changes needed to save us?
Well, statistically, I hear the stat that about 80% of the world's population is willing and ready to give up something personal in order to benefit the planet. I wouldn't quite say that I've seen that statistic realized. I think, though, that it's going to take collective action. But if we say it as an individual that it's not up to me, we've got 8 million individuals. So that's a lot of that's a lot of collective action right there. I don't want to say it's too late. I think one reason that I love being in the polar regions is that not only do we see changes happening really quickly negatively, but we can also see them happening really quickly in a positive way as well. So it's an area that really accentuates change. And so 2 years ago, for example, there was a little bit more snow that fell in Greenland, and we could see that changed the entire melt pattern for the year. And that has Greenland melt pattern, for example, has impacts on global sea level rise. We've destabilized that ice sheet right now, that without even further emissions, we've contributed at least a forthcoming 10 inches, 25 centimeters, 27 centimeters of global sea level rise, mostly in regions that are, of course, already vulnerable. So, these small changes do certainly add up. And this is a region that I get to spend a lot of time in, where we actually do see a lot of these positive changes when they happen. So I think I'd like to see, changes in greenwashing. We are seeing in certain countries greenwashing laws that are coming into play. And I met with a company the other day that is really having to shift a lot of their plans as a result of these new laws in Europe. The fossil fuel subsidies, absolutely inexcusable, with those hitting, 7 trillion. And so I think those are two things that I'd really like to see. But, I think the moment that we say it's too late, and then we start acting that way, then that really pushes us over a cliff that we still need to fight for.
That's good to hear. Okay, so you make sacrifices. I know that you try where possible, like Greta, not to take airplanes unless you absolutely have to. You do a lot of rail travel. So sacrifice. We've got 2 other activists on the panel here who have been willing to step up, make change. But before I talk to you, I wanted to just mention, you alluded, Dana, in the book to inspiration that we can draw from the women's movement, the civil rights movements, neither of which would have succeeded without, sit-ins and freedom riders. So what do you mean when you say that we may have to be unpopular and disruptive in the book?
Well, the book talks about collective action. So it starts with individual action, like a lot of the actions that Susana is talking about, to collective action through social movements. And I track out the different types of tactics and organizational arrangements that we see within the climate movement. And I'm really excited to hear from these women activists who are involved in different ones that are in their communities. But what I talk about there is the fact that, the normal progression of a social movement is that as the movement does not yet achieve its goals, it either fizzles out or it gets more radical. It radicalizes in its tactics and becomes more confrontational. So the climate movement is absolutely not going anywhere, because we are seeing climate change all around us, and more people are becoming upset and feeling the need to do something about it. So instead, what we will see, because it's been taking so long and the incremental politics that we see right now are insufficient, that people will start to take action. And as they do, what we will see is more and more people being comfortable with more confrontational action. Right now, what that means is we're seeing a lot of nonviolent civil disobedience, and we're seeing a lot of performative actions like throwing soup, crazy glue, blocking traffic. As the climate crisis wears on, assuming the movement follows the traditional trajectory that we see in other historical movements, the movement will continue to radicalize, continue to push even harder. And if you think about previous movements, particularly the civil rights movement, what that involved was more confrontation that was met with repression and counter movements, otherwise known as white supremacists. But there is absolutely a likelihood that we will see violence in the streets before this whole thing is over. And that's very, very normal, very common, and part of the way social movements work.
So this is a great in to Kathleen, who joins us from Maine. Hello, Kathleen. So I'd like to know a little bit about your path to climate activism. You said you were swept up in consumerism and success. And then 2 years ago, you realized that I was doing it all wrong, living by the wrong principles. So tell us a little bit about what you mean.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here with everybody. I've lived a long life, and it all looked so good, right? I mean, I was born in 1945. The world, the economy just absolutely expanded. America was the great hero in our country, in the whole world. You could buy anything anyway, the world was our oyster. And if you were white and, you know, and came from a middle class family, you had all kinds of opportunities ahead of you. And the idea was that success through, sort of self realization, was the most important thing that you could accomplish. And if you did that, you would find some kind of happiness. And I was fortunate enough to have a career, and I had a career as a clinical social worker. So I felt for 50 years I did this work, and never in the entire time that I did this work did I question the larger question of what's the effect of what's our relationship to Earth? What's our relationship to all the ways in which we are to Mother Earth, we are being supported by Earth? That was never, ever. The whole idea of interconnection, the whole idea of interrelationships, and that it is the interrelationships of our relationship to nature and of our relationship to each other, that's the critical thing that we have to pay attention to in order for all life on this planet to survive, was not a concept, a paradigm that I was either taught in school or conceived of for most of my adult life until it all started not to work. And then you have to say what's not working, what's happening, and then you start reading, and then you start realizing that all the ways in which I thought I would get happiness and I thought this would all work were based on an assumption that this would go on forever, that we'd have all these resources forever, that the Earth would continue to provide us with this. We didn't ask Earth, do we really have enough air and water and resources for us? We just said they're ours because that's the dominant paradigm. Figuring it all out at the age of 70, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, when I figured out I had the wrong paradigm, was earth-shaking in one way, but in another, it's thrilling because I get to learn something entirely new. I mean, I get to figure it all out again. I'm like a little kid. Oh, this is what it's about. Oh, this is how I can live my life, by being more in tune with the natural world, with relationships, with that I can, there's so much more that I have to learn. So anyway, it was a revolution of my mind. And I've been tracking what's happening to my mind, which has also been really interesting. I do a lot of writing. So it's been really helpful to keep tracking what's happening.
So you said you were white, educated, middle class, and used to the idea that you had agency over action. But then you came to this deeper understanding and you got involved with Bill McKibben's Third Act, helped create the Freeport Climate Action Now, which now has 1,000 members. So that's a lot of stuff. Tell us what happened. What triggered that 2 years ago?
So what triggered that 2 years ago was actually walking along the ocean. The sun had just risen and it was scarlet. And that was one of those, and it was scarlet because of the fires out west. And that was one of those acts, one of those moments that Dana was talking about, that just those moral crises of, oh my God, we have changed the color of the sun. But the second thing that happened at that moment is that I realized that I felt very lonely with my fear, that there weren't enough people that I knew who were talking about this in a deep way and trying to think about how to change it. So I wanted to be connected. I wanted to find people to do this with. So I practically, if I could have gotten in my car and driven out west, which was where the man who was Bob Fulkerson, who is the man who is the major organizer for Third Act, lived, I would have done that, just to say, what can I do? And I wanted to be with people my age because I wanted to be with people who understood the trajectory of this aha moment. And, and also I didn't want to leave it up to the young people. I thought we have really, as older people, as elders, had a big, but we made this mess. It was all my red velvet couches without knowing the effect of my red velvet couch that created this. So I feel that my people my age, have a responsibility to say, oh God, we got this wrong. We owe it to the next generations to try to figure this out as fast as we can. And so third act was working with older people. And I thought that was, and they were also going to work on a larger systems level. They were going to be working with the banks. They were going to be working with people and where we invest our retirement. They were going to be doing, civil action. And I thought that was really exciting. But then I wanted to do something more. So I got involved with third act, and we started a chapter here in Maine. But then I got even more ambitious. And I said, but I'd like to know what's happening in our community. If we're going to talk about relationships, let's just talk about this town of Freeport, Maine. Freeport, Maine, the center
Home of LL Bean.
of consumerism. Exactly. Consumer center. So here we are. So I wanted to do this with my neighbors, and I wanted to know what the mind of my neighbors was like. And actually, Susana was one of the first people who came and sat on my porch, and we talked about how we could start a climate action organization in Freeport. And we did, and that organization is very much geared towards lifestyle choices. What are you eating? How are you heating your house? How are you consuming? What are you recycling in terms of your clothes and your furniture, and what's your lifestyle, and what effect are you having on the world, on our resources, on everything out there with what you're consuming. So I'm doing that too.
So this is interesting because, of course, you're doing the systemic thing with third act, and then you're doing the more local activism with Freeport chapter. So you said you've got to be willing to cut up your Citibank credit card and get arrested. So
yes, so I mean,
are you willing to do that?
Oh yes. I tell people it's on my bucket list. I have not yet gotten arrested. So I'm willing to do that. But there is something just really important that I would really love to talk to Dana about. And that's my sense that many people my age, so who have awakened to this, they're feeling anxious about it, they understand they need to do something, and they do they do things. They do specific things. They go out and they put solar on their, get solar panels. They buy an electric car. They put heat pumps in their house. They probably eat maybe 1 or 2 more plant-based meals a week. And then they say to me, and I don't know what else I can do. I don't know, I've done enough. There's nothing else I can do. And these are people who are used to feeling agency. These are people who were, surgeons and, lawyers and ran companies, and they stop at that level of that kind of action. Because, my sense is this, and I'd love to hear from Dana. My sense is this, that my generation is so used to being successful in the here and now, not long-term, because we're not going to see the kind of actions. So the kind of actions that I think are necessary are for people to cut up their credit cards, to stand out in front of Chase Bank, to stand out in front of LL Bean and ask people to cut up their Citibank credit card because LL Bean has a Citibank credit card. I don't, people my age are not I'm finding them resistant to do that. Because I have this hypothesis, it's because they're not going to see an outcome very soon. And they're used to outcomes. They're used to successful outcomes quickly.
Well, I would just say, I mean, I think that your observation is absolutely right. And in fact, you originally, what you were just describing, actually described all the personal actions that I speak about in the book that I personally took, with my family took, to try to do our part. But I mean, but it's absolutely not enough. And in fact, I have an excerpt from the book that just went up at Brookings Institution for anybody who's interested in it, which is basically says why individual action is not going to save us. That people can check out. But what I think that it's not that people then say, oh, well, I'm not going to be around, it doesn't matter. I think that it's that we have really lost our civic identities in many parts of the United States, particularly. So we're not very connected. We're not very connected in our community. We're not really engaged. There are really easy things you can do. I mean, you can vote for one. We got a big election coming up and every single person needs to be voting. If you're not voting, well, then you can't be an American as far as I'm concerned. I mean, everybody who has the ability needs to take power in their hands that way. We can be supporting candidates who are taking fossil-free pledges, who will not take fossil fuel money. And there are some really great organizations who are pushing for that. But we can also build, resilience in our communities so that our communities are capable of withstanding the climate shocks that are coming. When there are hurricanes, there are wildfires, there are droughts, there are extreme heat. There are going to be we need to be able to help our, other people in our communities. And there are lots of ways to do that in our communities. We've gotten so isolated and individuated by society, by our culture, but also by our technology. And I think that those are the big steps that people can easily take. I mean, and anybody, who is from an older generation already hates the cell phone anyway. So we can easily talk about why that one needs to go. At least the idea that we can just get on our phones and solve the problem is just not true. And I talked to a lot of young people who thought that by doing the big TikTok campaign around the Willow Project, they were going to stop it, and are really, really disheartened by the fact that they didn't. So I think that there's a lot of evidence I could say out in the world, and from those of us who study this, about why you really need to connect to people and have these relational connections to people to make action. And I think helping to embed people, who have done all these things in their personal lives, to think about what they can do in their communities. Your schools can be places where you can create resilience, as well as, religious institutions and other institutions in your communities.
Okay, this is a great segue to go over to Pennie Opal Royal. She's our Indigenous activist and has been involved in many, many protest organizations since the 1980s, and has founded several climate and Indigenous rights groups. So before the fact that you've been arrested many times, I wanted to you pick up immediately on Kathleen's point and Dana's point, which is you are talking about in your tribes, the 7 generations, not the grandchildren, 7 generations in your decision-making. So tell us about the difference in the thinking, how different the thinking is, and how you can try and change people's ways with a different way of thinking. So welcome.
Yes, thank you. I'm honored to be here with everyone, everyone that I can see on the panels here, and everyone that's listening and watching. Yes, so in addition to the 7 generations, which is that decisions aren't made just for us. Important decisions especially are made in consideration of 7 generations into the future. And just imagine how different the world would be if presidents and corporate directors looked at the decisions that they were making and said, well, we can't really do this because look at what it's going to do 7 generations down the road. I mean, we would really have a different world. I grew up with a couple of other foundational principles and teachings, and one of them was that everything is connected, which my husband and I laugh pretty regularly at new science that comes out and says, hey, look, this particular, it would be string theory. It's like, well, oh, they're finally catching up to us. And the other one is that we're all related. So when people embody that, it's really difficult to cause harm to people that we don't know. We truly are one human family, regardless of the opinions and our actions in the world. And in recognition of that personally, and being the type of person that I am, which is very action-oriented, I started working on defending and protecting the sacred system of life in my very early 20s. And early on, one of the older women that I knew, she recently passed away, was telling a story about standing up against World War II when she was in high school. And at that moment, I realized that this work could be a lifelong process. And I made the decision to, yes, this is the life that I will have, and I will do everything in my power to protect and defend Mother Earth herself and the next 7 generations. And so that's what I've been doing. And it's part of my spiritual practice. So I don't very rarely accept money for this part of my life. I'm also a small business owner. I've had 5 successful small businesses. So I'm lucky in that way. And I think that, well, just a little bit more background. I grew up in Richmond, California, which is in San Francisco East Bay. And there are 5 oil refineries along the San Francisco East Bay that most people don't know about. And in 2012, the Chevron refinery, but that I could see from my house when I lived there, exploded and sent 15,000 of my community members to the hospital. So our Idle No More SF Bay Indigenous group had already hit the ground running in 2013. And so we started going to the regulatory agency meetings, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District and the California Air Quality Board. And pretty early on, we realized that these regulatory agencies have been captured by the fossil fuel industry. We spoke with people in those regulatory agencies. I had lunch with the head boss at the Bay Area agency, and we realized that they weren't going to listen to us. Even though we had the science, we could give them statistics about the harms that these were creating, not only to the health of people in our communities, but to the climate. And they blew us off. So we shifted our tactics and we started going to these meetings and disrupting them. And that felt really, really good to go into a meeting, to not only give our 3 minutes of testimony, but to go in there and raise our fist in the air and sing the Women's Warrior song and, completely disrupt the meeting so that they would walk out. And that's emotionally incredibly satisfying, but it didn't change anything. And it was devastating. To be quite honest, it was devastating. And when I look back at the climate march in New York City in 2014, the press was saying that there were over 400,000 people there in the streets. But the scanners, on the police scanners, people were telling me while we were there that the police were saying there were over 600,000 people there. It was so powerful, and Indigenous people were leading the march, which is what I've made sure happens at every climate march that I've organized or been involved in, because we are the most impacted. There are fossil fuel pipelines going through reservations that have already damaged rice fields, rice lakes up in Minnesota. The Dakota Access Pipeline fight and Standing Rock was a huge wake-up call for people. And I'm also a signatory on the Indigenous Women of the Americas Defending Mother Earth Treaty, which has signatories from the Amazon, my sisters in the Amazon, all the way up to my sisters in the Arctic Circle. And we talk to each other, we communicate, we support each other, and have for many years now. And when we were at the climate march, it was very empowering for us. But there has never been, since 2014, a climate march that's been even close to being that big. I helped organize some of the events in San Francisco it started out as a small climate summit, then it became a global climate summit in September of 2018. And the climate march there that we'd all worked so hard on was only 30,000 people. So we went from, on one coast, well over 600,000 people to 30,000 people. And that was also devastating. And it shifted my internal landscape about what we're doing. I think that probably the most important thing that we can do is put a stick in the wheel of capitalism, because the way of thinking that humanity has just grasped onto the consumer culture that stems from colonial governments dating back hundreds of years now is destroying what we need to simply exist on Earth. And not just our human family, but also all of our non-human relatives. And I hear the people, wonderful, good-hearted people talking about the resources of water and the resources of air and all the extraction that's happening around so-called resources. But in fact, those are the sources of life. They should have never been commodified. There's places in the world where you can go buy oxygen so that your lungs can have a little bit of better health. How awful is that? It's like apocalyptic science fiction movie, what we're seeing right now. But I do believe it can be rolled back. And two of the fastest growing movements in my lifetime, a lot of people working on climate issues aren't even aware of. And one of them is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has many countries that have signed on to it now. And it's very, very powerful, and it bypasses a lot of the things that I've already been talking about. And the other movement, which is based, its root is in the indigenous original instructions, which were and are instructions given to people who are still connected to the sacred system of life, who don't view nature as something separate than ourselves. Nature is something that we're a tiny part of. We're one of the most insignificant parts, with the exception that, like 2-year-olds, we're destroying our room. And this movement has also many, many nations that have, Bolivia, Ecuador, other nations that have signed on, that have put it into their constitution and put it into law, the rights of living systems, ecosystems. It could be a river, it could be a forest, it could be the whole system of nature, has rights in a court of law. So the river can't speak in very few places right now. The forest can't speak in very few places right now. But if we want to drink water and if we want to breathe clean air, then all of these natural systems should have standing in a court of law. All of the oceans should have standing in a court of law. Otherwise, the systems are failing. If we can't identify people to be guardians and speak on behalf of a forest in a court of law, then as humanity, we have failed, because we're destroying what we need to simply exist.
Very wise words. I mean, it all makes perfectly good sense, and it's timeless wisdom, but it doesn't fit with the capitalist way of thinking at all,
So let's put a stick in it. Let's just take a little pen and just poke it in there and make it stop, because that's what they pay attention to.
Okay, I'm going to talk about that for a very quick minute here, because we are running out of time. We've got reams of questions. You've been arrested, and you're part of this group called the Fearless Grandmothers now. So you teach nonviolent protest. How did you learn to be fearless?
You asked me that when we talked before, Mary, and I really had to think about it. My answer to you at that time was, I'm the oldest sibling, and I'm the oldest. Obviously I was a little girl, and I took care of my siblings as much as I could. But that there's also the realization that it's up to us. No one is going to come and save us. No one is coming to save us. It's up to every single one of us to let go of the fear, because if we don't do our jobs, future generations are going to suffer and billions of people will die. So that's the fact. If we don't do everything in our power with love in our hearts and joy, and with the gifts that we have to, to bring to this movement, because otherwise people just get wiped out and, exhausted. But if we're bringing the things that bring us joy to the movement, then we have sustaining power in that. I just decided to not be fearless. It's a decision that one makes. You decide, I'm not going to be fearless. There's more to life than embodying fear. And let's live large. Let's live really big right now. Future generations are depending upon us.
So in this quite adversarial environment we now find ourselves in regarding standing up to authority in this regard, even though it's righteous indignation, and you're right, we certainly should be doing this. What advice do you have? Everyone should be willing to be arrested, like Kathleen.
Well, I think that's a very good place to start. That being arrested is not what most people think. It's a very organized dance. There are, the National Lawyers Guild. When I'm choosing to risk arrest, their phone number is on my arm. There are support people. Like, people just don't go out and decide at the last minute, usually, to risk arrest. I personally have always risked arrest with my heart wide open. That changes everything in actions, in any kind of direct action, to go in there, not with the fear, not with the sadness, but with that feeling like, these are my relatives. These law enforcement folks are well, at this point, they're young enough to be my children and grandchildren. They're my relatives. And that shifts an energy in a certain kind of way that helps more people be safe. Like, bringing anger into the movement is not going to help us. It's just not. And I've had, most of my arrests were in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I acknowledge that that's a very different place to be arrested than at Standing Rock, where one of my friends, who's a very well-respected and high-profile Ponca elder, Casey Camp Hornick, was arrested. So she didn't expect to be arrested. Here's this elder with her sacred items, and they strip searched her and put her in a dog cage along with a bunch of other people that were standing up for the water there. So I totally recognize that in some places people are beat. I've been manhandled, but I've never been beat by law enforcement. And as a matter of fact, I always go and shake law enforcement's hands at all of the actions that we've taken. And I thank them for keeping us safe, even though we have blocked down 4 streets with large, long canvases so that murals could be made and the younger people behind us could be safe. And that's the Fearless Grandmothers, the Society of Fearless Grandmothers, which is a very loose organization. But if older women of grandmother age, don't literally have to be a grandmother, go to our Facebook page, where that's the only place that we function from. There's a video on training older women on how to do the kinds of things that we've done in the Bay Area and other places.
We should put that in the chat box for people, that link for people.
Society of Fearless Grandmothers on Facebook. And so as older women, we have a certain type of authority and a certain type of courage that, younger women don't have. Like, I told Mary this story when at one action, we had blockaded the street with long banners, and a young cop that I didn't know tried to go on the sidewalk. And I thought, and I explained to him that, when the other police officers get here, they're going to tell you to park your car horizontally in front of the banner. That's just what always happens here. And he tried to drive up on the sidewalk, and I just stood in front of him, and I was kind of laughing with my arms wide open, like, really? You're gonna run over a grandmother? And the other officer showed up and they told him to do what I had already suggested that he do. And we have that kind of authority as older women. That most of all law enforcement is younger than us. Like, we can do things from a perspective that younger women can't do. And for Indigenous women around the world are at the tip of the arrow of the climate justice, because so many of us are living in places that are being the first impacted. Like, look at Louisiana. There are tribes who have been living on these islands for time immemorial that have to move because they're losing, what is it, like 1 football field every hour or something of land in Louisiana along the coast, and not to mention, all the chemical, it's just awful there. It's terrible. Anyway.
I hate to cut you off. I really do, because all the stuff you're saying is very important, but I'm aware of the clock, that we never got to any of the questions. I do apologize to everyone. You can see what amazing speakers we've got today, but I would like to recap before we go. Dana has 3 recommendations, clear recommendations in the book about how we can build capacity to save ourselves. Briefly, Dana, if you want to hit those 3 things that you suggest again.
Great. Yeah. So the book ends with recommendations for what we can all do to help us save ourselves. And actually, some of the women here in this program represent many of them. So the first one is to create community and real solidarity. And there, the goal is actually not just to be engaged in action and activism, but actually to build in your community so that you actually have people across different identities, orientations that can work together to create, provide support. Number 2 is to capitalize on moral shocks. Now, moral shocks is something that we talk a lot about in the social sciences around social movements, and that is the fact that as activism grows, we will see these moments of violence, likely against nonviolent, activists who are being, who are engaging in civil disobedience. And those moments when we see that the action and violence against the protesters is actually a wonderful moment to help to mobilize more people to get involved. A great example of it is, if you recall, when Donald Trump decided to tear gas Lafayette Square during the summer of 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was murdered. And he did it to clear the park so he could do that photo op. But what happened afterwards, after all of these peaceful protesters were tear gassed, is that so many more people came out in the streets in solidarity. And it really mobilized more people who were watching and were like, I can't sit back anymore and let this happen. And third and finally is to cultivate resilience. And this is about, everybody doesn't have to be an activist. Some people are much more comfortable being engaged in their communities. I mean, everybody has to be engaged in some way, because we all have to work together to get us to the other side of the climate crisis. But you don't have to be. If you're not comfortable getting arrested, you shouldn't get arrested. If you're not comfortable going out and marching the streets, there's so many other things that people can do to build community and create resilience right in your community, and you should do those instead. So those are the 3.
Very good. Any last words of advice? Let's go first to you, Kathleen. A very quick word of advice.
Check your heart. Why are we all doing this? We're doing this because we care. Not because we're going to succeed and we know anything. Forget about success. Do this, and sort of what Pennie was saying, because we care, because we are connected, and because we love all of this. And
so what you're saying is align your values with your way of living.
Oh, I guess so.
That's what you said to me earlier.
But
you're living with your heart.
Get to your heart. Do you love this earth? Do you love not just your grandchildren, but the cardinals and the ocean waves flapping, and and the trees and your children and other people's children, if you love all that and it's all at risk, what else would you do but try to care for?
Susana.
It's a really hard one for me because I've been reckoning with it a lot myself. And I tend to live in a world that's very public. I do get to risk arrest and navigate that. And, and I'm lucky in that I can, tell my boss that I'm going to go get arrested, and my boss high fives me. And, so I'm feeling that, I do get to sort of really create the world in which I want to be acting. And that's, to me, really rewarding. But it's also, I think, for me, taking control of myself and making sure that I keep my energy where I want it. And so that's, I took a nap midday today because I just knew I was had a tough morning, and, and a couple tough weeks coming up, that just that self-care and being able to keep going, because this is certainly not a sprint in any means, but a long, tiring journey.
Pennie, last word.
I applaud people who are doing the things in their own homes to have less of an impact on climate. But what's really going to work is joining with other people. And so finding either in your community or, the big organizations that are organizing in whatever way that aligns with who you are, that those are the things that are going to make an impact and reduce, the fossil fuel industry, corporate ag, and all the things that are causing these serious life-threatening issues. So do it. And if you have to organize it, then organize it. Just figure it out. It's not that hard.
Well, great words from all of you. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Pennie. And thank you, Susana. And I think you're all doing invaluable work in all your ways, and you've contributed immensely to the program. And I think we've all benefited from hearing your advice and your experiences. And Dana's book is a very good read. It's an easy read. It's a tough read. I mean, it's easy that it's not that big, but it's full of stuff. So don't read it before you go to bed at night. Okay, but order it from the library. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, and of course, your good selves. So if you haven't given us anything for a while or ever, go to the website www.cambridgeforum.org, and you can sign up for the e-newsletter, which of course is free. We produce NPR broadcasts of Cambridge Forum. We'll post a podcast of this program on the website, and a video, thanks to our great partners, GBH Forum Network, will be edited and uploaded to YouTube shortly. So spread it around and let your friends see it and rewatch it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks.